So, as you probably know, a couple of months ago, Theresa May stepped down as Conservative Party leader. This kicked off a leadership race where 10 candidates competed to become her successor. The final stage left Conservative members with two options, Jeremy Hunt or Boris Johnson. Johnson, as expected, won the vote, which means that Boris Johnson is set to be the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. We've already put a video out about Johnson winning the role, and there's a link to that down below. So today we're going to dive deeper into Johnson's past and about the 32-year road that's led to him becoming the UK's new Prime Minister. Johnson's career started 32 years ago and way before he even entered into Parliament. He originally started work at the Wolverhampton Express and Star. However, his tenure at the Star didn't last long, with Johnson fired within months for fabricating quotes. Johnson quickly bounced back and used his contacts to get a job at the Daily Telegraph, reporting from Brussels. As you might expect by this point, a lot of his columns were highly Eurosceptic, and while he was far from the first to lead the Eurosceptic charge, he definitely contributed to the movement. However, a lot of people took issue with the quality of the articles that Johnson was producing, with one former chair of the Conservative Party, Chris Patten, commenting that Johnson was one of the greatest exponents of fake journalism. That's because Johnson was famous for many of the sensationalist stories you might hear about EU regulations, things like the infamous and quite often untrue EU bananas story. In fact, Johnson even brought back this style of EU criticism on the campaign trail, complaining about EU regulation on kippers, highlighting the plight of fishermen from the Isle of Man, forgetting there that the Isle of Man isn't actually part of the UK, or the EU for that matter, which means they're completely unaffected by any such regulations. Anyway, after his time in Brussels, Johnson continued his work in journalism back in London, before eventually turning his attention to politics. He attempted to run for MP in Holborn and St Pancras, but wasn't selected as the Conservative candidate for that constituency. Instead, he was selected as the party's candidate for Clwyd South. In the 1997 election, he lost that seat to Labour, only picking up 23% of the vote, though, to be fair, it was a fairly safe Labour seat. Johnson's political career really began in 2001, when he ran for MP in the safe Conservative seat of Henley, replacing Tory heavyweight Michael Heseltine. Even his candidacy in Henley was slightly controversial, with the book Just Boris commenting that some Conservatives thought he was amusing and charming, but others took issue with his attitude and lack of local knowledge. Despite this, he was nominated as the Conservative candidate in Henley and won the election with an 8,500 vote majority. In 2008, he set his eyes on a higher office, running to become the Mayor of London. Johnson ended up winning the race, despite 1. Being against the incumbent mayor, Ken Livingstone, 2. Running as a Conservative in a time when the party hadn't been in government for nearly 10 years, and 3. Running as a Conservative in a more liberal city. During the race for Prime Minister, Johnson actually spent a lot of time highlighting his achievements during his time as Mayor. Many took issue with his list of achievements as Mayor, either saying it was a distraction from his poor performance in Cabinet, or just completely refuting his list of claims. Johnson, throughout the campaign, made 4 broad claims surrounding his time as Mayor. On inner city crime, he said, "We cut the murder rate by 50%. On poverty and deprivation, when I became Mayor 11 years ago, we had 4 of the 6 poorest boroughs in the UK. When I left after 2 terms, we had none of the bottom 20. On housing, we outbuilt Labour with more than 100,000 affordable homes. And on transportation, we cut road traffic fatalities by 50%. Each of these claims is not without dispute, but we don't have enough time to run through all 4. So let's discuss his primary claim around crime rates. While in office, Johnson oversaw a fall in murder rate from 22 per million people to 12 per million people, a fall of about 46%, rather than the 50% he claimed, but we'll give him the benefit of the doubt when it comes to rounding. However, how this fall was achieved is yet another matter of contention, because it comes from the increased usage of police stop and search powers. In the first year of operation alone, the increased use of stop and search permitted by Johnson resulted in a sharp increase in searches, from just shy of 35,000 a year to in excess of 123,000 a year. The increased use of stop and search powers is in itself a contentious matter, not least when the Home Office study concluded that the increase in searches had no discernible crime-reducing effects. More than that though, it's pretty hard to attribute all of that 46% drop in murder rate to Johnson. During the same period, rates across the country fell by roughly similar amounts. Overall crime rates actually fell faster in the rest of the UK, by 26%, compared to London's 20%. It does certainly seem that despite the best efforts of Johnson's team in London, a lot of the decrease was the result of a larger trend across the UK. Johnson completed 2 terms as Mayor of London, choosing not to run again when the elections came back round in 2016. Instead, he opted to return to Parliament, this time as the Mayor of another safe Conservative seat, Uxbridge and South Ruislip. Upon returning to Parliament, Johnson very quickly got onto Brexit, making it one of the cornerstones of his political agenda. Johnson was very famously a key figurehead of Vote Leave, the official Leave campaign, automatically making Johnson a very controversial figure. However, this was a calculated decision. If he'd chosen to support Prime Minister David Cameron in the Remain camp, then he wouldn't have got the exposure he desired. If Remain won, then Cameron would have continued his premiership victorious. If they lost, Johnson would be on the sinking ship too. However, if he supported Leave, he could be a leader, a rebel in the fight. If they lost, then he would still be seen as a leader and a rebel. If they won, he'd be setting himself up perfectly to take over the party, exactly the reality we're discussing now. Either way, he worked out that he was better off in the Leave camp. However, the Brexit campaign wasn't a perfectly calculated attack, with some major gaffes damaging his reputation for many. This included accusing President Obama of opposing Brexit because of his ancestral dislike of Britain, thanks to his Kenyan heritage. This is far from the first time Johnson has made controversial remarks like this, with comments going from saying that women with burqas look like letterboxes or bank robbers, to referring to the continent of Africa as that country, or referring to gay people as bum boys, or even the time he simply stated, F business. To many, this is part of his charm. There's an increasing appetite for politicians who say it like it is, and don't worry about being politically correct. This certainly might not be to everyone's taste, but there's a segment of the electorate who like Johnson for his gaffes. To them, this makes him more human, more relatable, and more honest. But it certainly doesn't work for everyone. Regardless, he's certainly a very popular politician with a certain subset of the electorate, and he made a major impact on the Brexit campaign. Actually, an impact bigger enough to be objectively measured. A study conducted by YouGov shows a serious change in the electorate's voting intention, dependent on which side Johnson landed on. As part of the Leave campaign, Johnson found himself implicated with many of the scandals that associated the campaign. Johnson could be found regularly claiming that the UK will be able to save £350 million a week after Brexit, money which could be sent to the NHS instead. This popular claim has been widely debunked, and even the chair of the UK Statistics Authority described it as a clear misuse of official statistics. With Johnson as the unofficial leader of the Leave campaign, they had a major player on their side, and it proved very beneficial on results day. After the referendum, Johnson tried to take the reins as Prime Minister after David Cameron resigned. However, after political ally Michael Gove betrayed him, he found his campaign floundering, and never actually made it to the final rounds of selection. Johnson did make it into new Prime Minister Theresa May's cabinet though, gaining the title of Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs. Before we discuss his tenure in May's cabinet, it's worth noting quite how little government experience Johnson actually has. When you compare the amount of time that he spent in either a government or shadow cabinet role to the other candidates, it's certainly clear that he's lacking experience, with the least amount of time spent in a government role when compared to all of the other candidates. Sorry to keep going on about Johnson's controversies, but his time as Secretary of State was absolutely littered with them. Johnson made a rather tense trip to Turkey months after writing an offensive poem about their Prime Minister. He refused to block UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia, also accusing Saudi Arabia of playing proxy wars, directly in contrast to the UK's view on the state, something that May later had to clarify. He allegedly told Iranian officials that a UK citizen arrested in their country had simply been teaching their people journalism. This was used against her and resulted in her sentence being doubled. He also discussed alcohol during a speech at a Sikh temple, and he recited a Rudyard Kipling poem on a visit to Myanmar, a former British colony, something the ambassador described as not appropriate. Maybe it's not surprising then that he only actually lasted 2 years in this role. Possibly more surprising is the fact that he left of his own volition, departing in reaction to May's Brexit plan, commenting during his resignation speech that ministers were saying one thing to the EU about what we're doing and pretending another to the electorate. Johnson then returned to the backbenches, working to use his influence to shape Brexit rather than using any direct powers. That wasn't until May resigned and Johnson mounted his campaign to run for the top job. In fact, Johnson announced his intention to run before May had even announced her resignation. But none of this was a surprise to anyone, considering that many believe he had his eyes on the role for years. Johnson's campaign to succeed May wasn't without its controversy either. But him taking the reins seemed almost inevitable from the beginning, with polling putting him as far more likely to win than his main competitor from the very beginning. Johnson was a clear frontrunner, and it looked like no one else ever even really stood a chance. Johnson's history meant that he was able to talk about his successes as mayor and in the Leave campaign, but ultimately it was his Brexiteer credentials which likely swung the vote. The decision to go against Cameron during the Brexit referendum and risk supporting the Leave campaign seems to have paid off. Now the question is whether he can make a success of Brexit, and how long he can actually stay in number 10 for. If you want to know more about the campaign, and about Johnson taking over as Prime Minister, we have a whole video about that. There's a link to it in the description. We'll be sure to keep you updated on Johnson's premiership and his first few days. To make sure you don't miss any of that, subscribe to this channel, and if you want to be notified every time we release a video, then click the bell icon. You can also find us across other social channels simply by searching for TLDR News. Also, if you want your name to appear at the end of the video, like these people, then you can sign up to become a Patreon. There's a link to that in the description below.